The Ferrari was already burning when Mason Rourke saw a woman pounding against the driver's window. Flames had swallowed the rear quarter, the electronic locks were dead, and black smoke filled the cabin. Everyone else backed away, terrified the fuel tank would ignite. Mason didn't. He jumped into his battered Ford pickup, wrapped a recovery chain around the Ferrari's warped doorframe, and slammed the truck into reverse. Metal screamed. Glass exploded. The entire door ripped free. He dragged the trapped woman out seconds before the Ferrari erupted into a wall of fire, and then he noticed something inside the smoking wreck that proved the crash was no accident at all. Stay with Mason, because pulling Blair Kensington from the flames was only the beginning of the trap someone had built around her that night. Mason Rourke was driving his old Ford pickup back toward his garage after a parts run when a red Ferrari blew past him on the two-lane highway, moving far too fast for the curve ahead. He barely had time to register the taillights before he saw the flash of orange light in his rearview mirror. The Ferrari had clipped the guardrail, spun once, and come to rest at an angle across the shoulder smoke, already curling from beneath the rear bodywork. Within seconds, the smoke turned to fire, licking up from the engine bay and crawling toward the cabin. Mason slowed, then stopped, pulling his truck onto the gravel a short distance away. A handful of other drivers had already stopped, two phones raised, none of them moving closer. The heat coming off the car was enough to make grown men step backward, and somewhere in the chaos a stranger was shouting for everyone to stay clear because the whole thing looked ready to go up. Inside the car, Blair Kensington was still conscious, still sharp enough to understand exactly how much danger she was in. The electronic door locks had failed the instant. The crash disabled the car's power system, and the manual release, buried beneath a carbon fiber panel, wouldn't budge no matter how hard she pulled. She pounded her palm against the window, watching the smoke thicken around her, watching the fire crawl closer through the rear glass. A man near the front of the small crowd yelled for everyone to get away, that the thing was going to blow, and for a moment it seemed like nobody intended to do anything but watch. The heat rolling off the wreck was strong enough that it warped the air above the asphalt, and the smell of burning rubber and scorched paint drifted across the entire stretch of highway. Somewhere behind Mason, a woman was recording the scene on her phone instead of calling for help, and a man in a delivery uniform kept repeating that someone should call for a real rescue crew. As if a real rescue crew might materialize out of the smoke before the fire finished its work. Mason didn't run toward the fire, and he didn't run away from it either. He walked back to his truck, popped the tailgate, and pulled out a length of heavy recovery chain he kept for towing wrecked vehicles out of ditches. He studied the Ferrari's doorframe for 2 or 3 seconds, long enough to see exactly where the metal had buckled, then looped the chain through the warped seam and hooked the other end to his truck's frame. His first attempt did nothing but tighten the chain and groan against the ruined door. The fire was closer now, close enough that the paint along the rear fender had begun to blister and peel. Inside, Blair's vision was starting to blur from the smoke filling the cabin. Mason climbed back into the driver's seat of his Ford, put it in reverse, and pressed the accelerator all the way to the floor. The chain snapped taut. The truck's tires spun for a heartbeat against the loose gravel, caught, and then the entire door of the Ferrari tore free of its hinges in a shriek of tortured steel and shattering glass. Mason was out of the truck before the dust settled, reaching into the smoking cabin, unbuckling Blair with hands that didn't shake despite the heat pressing against his forearms. He pulled her free and half-carried, half-dragged her away from the car, putting distance between them and the flames with every step. Less than 10 seconds later, the Ferrari's fuel line finally gave way, and the whole vehicle erupted, throwing a column of fire and black smoke into the evening sky. For a moment, nobody moved. The bystanders, who had been too afraid to get close now, stood frozen, in a different kind of disbelief, watching a stranger in a work shirt do what none of them had been willing to attempt. A teenager filming the scene lowered his phone without realizing it. Somewhere a siren finally began to rise in the distance, faint and still minutes away, arriving long after the moment that actually mattered had already passed. Blair lay on the pavement a safe distance from the wreck, coughing, staring at what had been a car worth more than most houses, and was now a bonfire on the side of a public road. But Mason wasn't looking at the fire anymore. He was crouched near the twisted remains of the engine bay, studying a section of scorched wiring that had partially survived the blast. Tangled among the factory harness was a small connector that didn't belong there. A component he recognized from years earlier. back when he'd spent his days analyzing vehicles after controlled crash tests for a major automaker. It wasn't Ferrari's part. It wasn't anyone's stock equipment. Mason said quietly, almost to himself, that the fire hadn't started on its own, and though he didn't realize it in the moment, Blair Kensington, still lying on the asphalt behind him, heard every word. Fire trucks and a convoy of black security vehicles arrived within minutes, and the quiet stretch of highway transformed into a controlled scene of flashing lights and clipped radio chatter. Nora Whitlock, the head of Blair's personal security, moved through the chaos like she owned it, sealing off the area before the paramedics had even finished checking Blair's vitals. Blair had suffered minor burns and smoke inhalation, nothing that required a hospital by her own insistence. And the first words out of her mouth, once she could speak clearly, were not about her injuries. She asked where the man with the truck had gone. Mason was still standing near his Ford, surveying the fresh dent along the frame where the chain had bitten into the metal during the pull. Nora approached him the way a security professional approaches an unknown variable at the scene of an attack on her principal, which is to say with immediate suspicion rather than gratitude. She asked for his phone, told him to step back from the area, and made it clear she considered him a person of interest rather than a rescuer. Mason didn't hand over anything. He simply stated that he'd pulled the door off a burning car with his truck and had no intention of being treated like a criminal for it. Blair walked over before the standoff could escalate. It was the first real look she got at the man who had saved her life. A stranger in oil-stained work clothes, hands scraped raw from the chain and the doorframe, standing next to a decades-old pickup truck that looked like it belonged in a different economic universe than the one she lived in. She told him flatly that he had just destroyed a Ferrari to get her out. Mason glanced at his own dented truck and answered that her Ferrari had come pretty close to destroying his. It was a small, strange moment of levity inside a scene that was otherwise entirely tense, and it was enough to make Blair pause and actually study his face, rather than simply categorizing him as a stranger. She noticed the calm in his eyes, the complete absence of the shaken adrenaline-soaked energy that gripped everyone else at the scene, including her own security detail. In her world, people either wanted something from her or were afraid of her, and Mason appeared to be neither. He was simply a man who had done what needed doing and was already thinking about something else entirely, which unsettled her more than any flattery ever could have. Mason told her about the connector he'd seen in the wiring, the part that didn't match anything a factory Ferrari would carry. Nora dismissed it, immediately pointing out that a modern supercar carried thousands of individual electronic components, and that a mechanic glancing at charred wreckage for a few seconds couldn't possibly identify an anomaly with any confidence. But Blair's expression shifted the moment Mason described what he'd seen, because, 3 days earlier, that exact car had gone through a specialized inspection at her own company's private technical center, and there had been exactly one person who signed off on releasing it back to her, her chief operating officer, Gavin Stroud. Blair didn't say his name out loud in front of the crowd. She wasn't ready to accuse anyone yet. Instead, she ordered her team to preserve the wreck exactly as it was and to allow no one to touch it without her direct authorization. As the tow crew prepared to haul the burned Ferrari away, Mason noticed a man in a Kensington Velocity technician's uniform standing at the edge of the scene, watching everything with far too much focus for someone who had no official reason to be there. The man realized Mason had spotted him and turned away quickly, disappearing into the crowd of onlookers before anyone could stop him. Mason memorized the license plate of the car he climbed into. He didn't mention it to Nora yet, mostly because he still wasn't sure who among the people surrounding Blair could actually be trusted. Later that night, when Nora ran the plate against Kensington Velocity's official technician rosters, she found no record of anyone matching that vehicle being dispatched to the scene at all. The wrecked Ferrari was transported to a secure Kensington Velocity facility for a full forensic inspection, and Blair insisted that Mason be part of the process, since he was the only person who had noticed anything unusual before the fire consumed most of the evidence. The decision did not sit well with her engineering staff. One senior technician looked Mason up and down, took in his garage uniform, and asked with open contempt whether the company was now taking forensic guidance from a tow truck mechanic. Mason said nothing in response. He simply walked toward the burned chassis and began working, and within minutes it became clear to everyone watching that he was not an amateur. It was here that pieces of Mason's past came into focus. Years earlier, before he opened his own garage, he had worked as a technician specializing in post-collision vehicle failure analysis for a major manufacturer, the kind of job that required understanding exactly how and why a car failed under extreme stress. He had left the industry to raise his daughter alone after his wife passed, choosing the slower, quieter life of restoring trucks and performance vehicles instead. He was not, as the engineer had assumed, an ordinary mechanic pulled off the street. Blair began watching him differently once she understood that, less like a stranger who happened to be nearby, and more like someone whose instincts were worth trusting. The forensic team's findings only deepened the mystery. A significant portion of the car's final diagnostic data had been deliberately wiped. One sensor had been sending a false reading in the moments immediately before the crash. The electronic door locking system had lost power almost simultaneously with the collision, which shouldn't have happened under normal failure conditions. And the car's onboard camera, which recorded continuously during every drive, had stopped functioning several minutes. Mason walked the team through it piece by piece, refusing to let anyone dismiss a single anomaly on its own, insisting that a real investigator never looked at failures in isolation, but always asked, what chain of events could make so many unrelated systems break down within the same narrow window of time? One of the younger technicians, the same one who had mocked him earlier, started taking notes without being asked. Mason focused on the strange connector he'd spotted at the roadside, and after a closer inspection under proper lighting, he confirmed what he suspected: someone had physically installed an unauthorized component into the vehicle's electrical system before Blair ever got behind the wheel. It wasn't random damage from the crash. It had been placed there with intention. But identifying the sabotage was only half the problem, because the internal service log showed that the last person to have direct access to the Ferrari before it was returned to Blair was Caleb Dwyer, the company's lead engineer. Nora immediately ordered a search for him. No one could reach him by phone, by email, or through any of his usual channels, and his sudden silence looked to almost everyone in the room like guilt. Gavin Stroud arrived at the facility not long after, projecting exactly the kind of controlled outrage a loyal executive was supposed to show. He demanded the entire technical team be suspended, pending investigation, insisted the company's reputation was at stake, and pushed hard for Caleb to be named publicly as the likely saboteur before any formal evidence had been gathered. Mason watched him closely while he spoke. There was something too eager in the way Gavin wanted a name attached to blame this quickly, something that didn't match the careful, methodical way Blair herself was approaching the investigation. Blair noticed it too, though she said nothing in the moment, filing the observation away the same way she filed away every piece of information that might matter later. She had worked alongside Gavin for nearly 9 years, had trusted him through 2 difficult product launches and 1 bruising round of layoffs, and some part of her still resisted the idea that the man who had stood beside her through all of it might now be the one trying to end her career. Worse, she kept that resistance to herself, aware that doubt could be just as dangerous as certainty if it clouded her judgment at the wrong moment. That night, reviewing data pulled from his own phone, Mason traced the license plate of the fake technician who had vanished from the roadside earlier. The vehicle was registered to a shell company, one with no public employees, no visible operations, and no obvious connection to Kensington Velocity at all. Digging one layer deeper revealed that the shell company was itself owned by an investment fund, quietly acquiring shares of Kensington Velocity over the past several months, buying up stock through intermediaries in a pattern designed to avoid triggering any public disclosure requirements. Someone outside the company had a direct financial interest in what happened to Blair Kensington, and that interest appeared to be growing by the day. It was Blair who finally explained why the stakes were so much larger than a single sabotaged car. In 48 hours, the Kensington Velocity Board of Directors was scheduled to vote on a deal worth $4.2 billion, a merger that would fold the company's autonomous vehicle division into a much larger conglomerate. Blair opposed the deal fiercely, believing it would gut the safety culture she had spent a decade building. Gavin supported it just as fiercely, publicly framing it as the only path to survival in a shrinking market. If Blair died, or if she became incapacitated and unable to lead, Gavin would step in as acting chief executive, and under acting leadership the vote would almost certainly pass. For the first time, motive had a name attached to it, even if proof still did not. Blair laid out the mechanics of the deal for Mason in plain terms, since he had never operated in a world where a single vote could move that much money in an afternoon. The merger would fold her company's autonomous systems division into a much larger conglomerate, controlled by a group of investors more interested in short-term stock performance than long-term safety standards, the exact opposite of everything she had built her reputation on. She had spent 10 years arguing that speed to market meant nothing if the vehicles themselves couldn't be trusted, and losing this vote would undo a decade of that work in a single afternoon. Blair wanted to go public immediately with what they'd found about the sabotage. Mason talked her out of it. If whoever was behind the attack believed Blair had already uncovered the plot, they would move fast to destroy any remaining evidence before it could be traced back to them. Mason suggested something riskier and smarter: let the world believe the fire had been a mechanical failure, nothing more than an unlucky, tragic accident involving a fast car and a dangerous road. Gavin predictably was thrilled when Blair publicly accepted that explanation, and within a day, a coordinated media narrative began circulating that quietly shifted blame toward Blair herself, painting her as a reckless executive who had been driving too fast for conditions. Blair was furious reading the coverage. Mason told her that was exactly the reaction they wanted people to see. As long as her enemies believed she was simply defending her reputation rather than hunting down a conspiracy, they would grow careless. From that point forward, the two of them began working in parallel. Mason dug into the physical evidence surrounding the Ferrari itself. Blair quietly traced the flow of money moving through the shell, companies buying up her stock, and Nora turned her scrutiny inward, examining her own security team for any sign of a leak. What they found next was worse than any of them expected. The Ferrari wasn't the only vehicle that had been tampered with. Maintenance records for 3 other cars Blair regularly used showed unexplained alterations stretching back months, meaning someone had built multiple opportunities to eliminate her, and the burning Ferrari on the roadside had simply been the first one to succeed. Nora went quiet when she saw the full list, running her fingers along the edge of the printout, as though the paper itself might explain how she had missed it. She had built her entire career on the assumption that threats came from outside the company, from strangers, from rivals, from people with nothing to lose. It had never occurred to her that the danger might be sitting 2 floors above her office, signing approval forms with the same steady hand it always had. Finding Caleb Dwyer turned out to be harder than expected. Mostly because he wasn't running from the truth. He was hiding from the people trying to bury it. He reached out to Mason directly through a brief, careful message, warning him not to bring any of Blair's official security to wherever they met. Mason went alone in his Ford, following Caleb's instructions to an abandoned machine shop on the outskirts of town, the kind of forgotten industrial space nobody thought to look twice at. Caleb explained everything once he was sure Mason had come without an escort. Weeks earlier, Gavin had personally instructed the engineering team to install a hidden data collection system into the vehicles Blair drove, most often framing it internally as an experimental telemetry program. Caleb had refused to authorize the installation, recognizing it for what it likely was. Not long after his refusal, his system credentials were quietly duplicated, and someone using his exact access rights began altering the Ferrari's service records without his knowledge. By the time Caleb realized what was happening, he had already copied a portion of the incriminating data onto a private drive, intending to bring it directly to Blair. Before he could, he noticed unfamiliar vehicles following him, and he went dark instead, trusting no one inside the company's walls. Their conversation was cut short when an SUV pulled up outside the machine shop, engine idling, clearly not a coincidence. Mason understood immediately that whoever had been watching Caleb had followed the signal straight to this meeting. There was no gunfight, no dramatic standoff, only the practical, adrenaline-soaked reality of 2 men getting out of a dangerous situation using nothing but a truck and a knowledge of the terrain. Mason used the tight, junk-filled layout of the old shop to maneuver the Ford between stacked machinery and loading docks, buying just enough space to get Caleb into the passenger seat and pull out through a service exit before the SUV could box them in. The SUV clipped the Ford's rear bumper once trying to force it off the access road, and for a few seconds, the truck fishtailed hard enough that Caleb braced both hands against the dashboard, certain they were about to roll. Mason corrected the slide without lifting off the throttle, cutting through a service gap between two collapsed storage buildings that the pursuing driver clearly hadn't scouted in advance. They lost their pursuers a few miles down an old access road, hearts pounding, neither of them speaking, until the adrenaline finally began to fade. Once they were safely back at Mason's garage, Caleb handed over the storage drive he'd risked everything to protect. Buried inside it was a file labeled Project Override, and the approval trail attached to it did not point to Caleb, and it did not point to Gavin either, at least not directly. The digital signature authorizing the override program belonged to Blair Kensington's own executive account. The revelation landed like a second explosion. Gavin wasted no time capitalizing on it, calling an emergency session of the board and presenting the falsified approval as proof that Blair herself had authorized the very system responsible for disabling her car. He didn't accuse her of trying to end her own life. He offered something far more damaging and far more believable to a room full of shareholders, the story that Blair had secretly been testing an uncertified experimental system, that the test had gone catastrophically wrong, and that afterward she had tried to shift the blame onto the company to protect her own reputation. It was a narrative built to end her career without anyone having to prove attempted murder at all. The board reacted swiftly. Blair's access to internal systems was suspended pending a full investigation, and Nora, despite everything, was ordered to bar Blair from entering the company's central data facility until the matter was resolved. Within a matter of hours, the woman who ran Kensington Velocity had no company car, no executive office access, no assistant answering her calls, nothing but the clothes she was wearing and the people who still believed her. Reporters who had spent years describing her as one of the sharpest executives in the industry now filled their coverage with words like disgraced and reckless recycling. Gavin's version of events without a single call to verify.call. Old colleagues, who had once fought for a seat at her table, stopped returning messages within a matter of hours, and Blair understood with a clarity that stung more than she expected exactly how quickly power could evaporate once the story controlling it changed hands. Mason had become almost by accident the only person outside the corporate structure that Blair still trusted completely. She sat in the passenger seat of his dented Ford outside the very headquarters she had built her career around, staring up at the glass tower, with an expression Mason hadn't seen on her before. She said quietly that yesterday she had owned that entire building. Mason told her to stop fighting to get the building back and start fighting for the truth instead. Because the truth, unlike a title or a boardroom seat, couldn't be taken away by a vote. It was Caleb who found the next thread to pull. He discovered that Blair's digital signature had been duplicated through a specific terminal inside the executive boardroom. A machine with extremely limited physical access. Security footage from that night showed Gavin never once entering the room. It showed someone else instead. It showed Nora Whitlock. Blair's reaction was immediate and visceral. Nora had protected her for years, had been in the room for nearly every major decision of Blair's career, and the idea that her own head of security might be the one who forged the signature felt like a betrayal deeper than anything Gavin could have engineered. Mason refused to jump to conclusions before hearing the full story, and he confronted Nora directly, rather than letting suspicion fester unchecked. Nora admitted she had entered the boardroom that night, but not for the reason anyone assumed. She explained that she had already begun quietly investigating irregularities inside the company weeks earlier, long before the Ferrari ever caught fire, and her presence in that room had been part of her own private effort to find out who was manipulating internal systems. To prove it, she produced footage of her own, the original, unedited security recording rather than the version presented to the board, which showed clearly that someone else had entered the room after Nora left. The intruder had used a special guest access credential, one that only a small handful of executives had the authority to issue, and that authority belonged almost exclusively to Gavin Stroud. Nora walked Blair through the footage twice, frame by frame, pointing out the exact timestamp where the guest credential unlocked the terminal room door, a detail so small that whoever pulled the original edited clip together had clearly assumed no one would ever look at the raw file underneath it. Still, a guest badge alone wasn't enough to prove Gavin himself had ordered anything. They needed something that connected him directly to the sabotage rather than merely to an unusual access log he could claim ignorance about. Mason turned to the one piece of evidence, Nobody in the corporate world had thought to examine the dashboard camera in his own Ford, which had captured a wide, unglamorous view of the roadside in the minutes leading up to the fire. Buried in that footage was the fake technician's car, exactly where Mason remembered seeing it, and when they zoomed in on the moment the man walked away from the scene, they could see clearly that he was making a phone call. Nora cross-referenced the timing against the company's legitimate call records and found a match. The call had connected directly to a device registered to the chief operating officer's office. Gavin was now tied undeniably to the exact moment the sabotage was set in motion. But he was clever enough that he could still claim the technician had acted alone. Some rogue employee overstepping his authority without direct orders, unless they could find something that proved Gavin himself had given the command. Caleb remembered one more detail buried in his research. Before the Ferrari's onboard systems were wiped clean, the vehicle had automatically transmitted a backup copy of its telemetry data to an external server. A routine safeguard most people had forgotten still existed. The destination was an aging test server from an old engineering program, one that had been scheduled for permanent decommissioning the following morning. If they didn't retrieve what was on it before then, it would be gone forever, along with any hope of proving Gavin's direct involvement. Mason, Blair, and Caleb raced to the old testing facility as the clock ran down toward the server's scheduled shutdown. Gavin, realizing what they were after, moved just as fast, ordering their access credentials revoked before they could even reach the building. Blair stood at the front gate of the very company she had built, badge in hand, and watched it flash red with denial, a stark, humiliating image of exactly how much power had been stripped from her in a single day. It was Mason who found another way in, not through any executive privilege or special clearance, but through sheer familiarity with how old industrial facilities like this one actually operated behind the scenes. He led them through a service entrance rarely used since the site's early days, and they reached the engineering wing just as the server's shutdown sequence began its final countdown. A maintenance alert flashed across the terminal, warning that the decommissioning sequence had already begun, giving them only minutes before the drive would be wiped and the server itself physically removed the following morning. Caleb worked fast, pulling the archive telemetry before the system purged itself for good. The data confirmed everything. Moments before the crash, the Ferrari had received a remote command that didn't originate from any authorized Ferrari software system, a command that systematically disabled a cascade of safety functions within seconds of each other. The signal carried a specific device identifier, and Nora traced it without hesitation straight back to a device registered to Gavin Stroud. But the most damning piece of all was something none of them expected to find: a stored voice authentication log required by the override system before it would execute any command at all. In it, unmistakably, was Gavin's own voice giving the order to execute the override. Blair sat with that recording for a long moment without speaking. Mason finally said quietly that now she had him. Blair shook her head slowly, correcting him. She said now she was going to let Gavin believe he still had her. She spent that night drafting nothing, sending nothing, changing nothing about her outward behavior, letting every signal reaching Gavin continue to suggest a broken executive with no options left. It was, Mason realized, the same instinct he'd seen in her at the roadside days earlier, the refusal to move until the moment guaranteed the outcome she wanted. The morning of the vote arrived, and Gavin walked into the boardroom, believing Blair had already been broken beyond recovery. Around the long table sat the company's lawyers, its largest investors, and its financial advisors, all waiting to hear the final case for a merger worth $4.2 billion. Gavin stood before them and calmly laid out his version of events, describing a reckless chief executive who had endangered company assets through an unauthorized experimental program, and who now needed to be formally removed for the good of the organization. He recommended his own appointment as permanent chief executive and urged the board to approve the merger without further delay, reminding the room that every day of hesitation cost shareholders money and that the company could not afford to be paralyzed by what he called an unfortunate personal tragédie. Several board members nodded along, already halfway convinced, their attention more fixed on the $4.2 billion figure than on the man presenting it. The doors opened before he could finish. Blair walked in, and behind her was not the usual army of corporate lawyers Gavin expected, but three people: Mason, Nora, and Caleb. They moved into the room without hurry and with without theatrics, carrying nothing more dramatic than a laptop and a thin folder of printed pages, and yet the entire room seemed to sense immediately that something had shifted the moment the doors closed behind them. Gavin looked at Mason and sneered, asking if the tow truck guy had come to watch the show. Mason met his eyes without flinching and told him the truck had worked out a lot better than his Ferrari had. Blair asked for the main screen to be activated. The recovered telemetry data appeared first, showing the exact moment the override command disabled the Ferrari's safety systems. Then came the terminal access logs tracing the forged signature back to the guest credential Gavin himself had issued. Then the phone records, linking his office directly to the man who had stood watching from the roadside the night of the fire. And finally, filling the silence of the boardroom, came the recording of Gavin's own voice giving the command to execute the override. Nobody said a word. One of the investors who had been nodding along minutes earlier slowly set down his pen, staring at Gavin with an expression that had shifted from confidence to open suspicion. Another board member asked quietly whether legal counsel should be brought in immediately, and nobody answered because nobody needed to. Gavin rose halfway out of his chair as if he might simply walk out of the room and pretend none of it had happened, but Nora was already standing at the door, blocking his exit without needing to raise her voice. Blair didn't shout either. She simply walked the length of the table, placing a printed summary of the evidence in front of every single board member, page by page, until the full picture was impossible to ignore. The sabotage of the Ferrari, it turned out, had only been the opening move. Gavin had spent months quietly funneling money through a network of shell companies to buy up shares of Kensington Velocity ahead of Blair's anticipated death, understanding that her sudden loss would send the stock price crashing before an eventual recovery once the merger went through under his leadership. His firms would then buy even more shares at the bottom of that crash, and the merger itself, the very deal he had been publicly championing, would multiply his personal fortune by hundreds of millions of dollars. All of it built on the assumption that a dead chief executive could not ask questions, and a grieving company would not slow down long enough to look too closely at who benefited most from the tragedy. It had never been an accident. It was a hostile takeover, engineered around the planned death of a sitting chief executive. Gavin was removed from the boardroom to face a formal investigation and the long list of legal consequences that came with it, and the $4.2 billion merger he had spent months pushing was suspended indefinitely. The board voted unanimously to restore Blair's full authority as chief executive, closing the corporate chapter of the story with almost surgical efficiency. But the story's real ending, the one that actually mattered, wasn't about boardrooms or stock prices at all. It was about a man and a truck. Several weeks later, Mason was back at his garage elbow deep in an engine rebuild when a small convoy of Kensington Velocity vehicles rolled up outside. Blair stepped out dressed far more casually than he'd ever seen her and handed him a plain envelope. Mason assumed it was some kind of reward payment and started to hand it back unopened. Blair told him he might want to actually read something before refusing it. Inside wasn't a check at all. It was an offer to lead an entirely new division within the company, one focused on vehicle safety and failure analysis, built specifically around the kind of expertise Mason had walked away from years earlier. He turned down the executive title without hesitation, telling her plainly that he had no interest in becoming part of the corporate world she lived in. The endless meetings, the quarterly targets, the version of success that seemed to measure a person's worth by how much of their own life they were willing to trade away for it. Blair didn't argue the point, since she had spent enough time around his garage over the past few weeks to understand exactly why a man who had already given up so much would want to protect what little piece he had left. They eventually settled on something that suited them both far better. Kensington Velocity would build a dedicated research facility right next to Mason's garage, and Mason would run it entirely on his own terms, answering to no one but himself. Mason showed her around the shop while they talked past a half-restored muscle car up on lifts and a wall of hand-labeled parts bins that had clearly been organized by someone who trusted his own system more than any inventory. Software. Blair seemed genuinely at ease there, in a way he hadn't seen in the sterile glass conference rooms of her own headquarters, running her fingers along the edge of a workbench, like she was trying to understand what kind of life produced a man like him. Blair glanced over at the old Ford, still carrying the deep dent along its frame. from the night she was pulled free of the burning Ferrari. She asked if he was ever planning to fix that door. Mason said no. When she asked why, he looked at the crumpled metal for a moment before answering that it was the best thing his truck had ever hit. Blair laughed for the first time in weeks, a real laugh, unguarded, and a little surprised at itself. And for a moment, the distance between a billion-dollar company and a small roadside garage didn't feel like a distance at all. Months later, Kensington Velocity held a major unveiling event for its newest line of high-performance vehicles. Ferraris, Porsches, McLarens, and one-off prototypes worth millions of dollars sat in a gleaming row beneath the event lights, polished to a mirror shine. Each one surrounded by its own small crowd of investors and journalists, snapping the dew, photographs of curves and paint jobs that had cost more to design than most people would earn in a lifetime. And parked right in the center of them all was Mason's old Ford unrepainted dent, still visible exactly as it had looked the night it tore a door off a burning supercar. Beside the truck stood the scorched, twisted remains of that very Ferrari door, preserved and displayed like a piece of art, with a single line printed on the placard. Beneath it, "Technology can fail, but courage still needs a driver." One by one, the reporters who had come to photograph the new prototypes drifted toward the battered Ford, instead drawn less by the truck itself than by the story now printed beneath it, a story that had nothing to do with horsepower or top speed, and everything to do with the fact that courage, unlike a paint job, couldn't be manufactured on a production line. Blair stood next to Mason, watching the crowd gather thicker around the old pickup than around any of the million-dollar machines surrounding it. She smiled and told him his truck had just stolen her entire show. Mason looked at the dent one more time and said simply that it wouldn't be the first time.